Welcome travelers to Adventures in Security. This video, the first in a series of 3 on cybersecurity risk analysis, addresses the steps in a risk analysis process. The second video describes the different threat modeling frameworks, and the third walks through a risk analysis for a fictitious financial organization. If you like what you see, if you learned something, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Ensuring the security and resilience of organizational operations is increasingly critical, given the improving methods of attack and use of technology in every phase of business operation. Cyber threats continue to evolve, targeting a wide range of vulnerabilities, both technical and non-technical, and can disrupt essential services, tarnish reputation, and incur significant financial and regulatory consequences. Consequently, a comprehensive cybersecurity risk analysis is indispensable to identify, prioritize, and manage the various risks that modern organizations face. This video provides a structured approach to conducting a cybersecurity risk analysis, beginning with identifying mission essential functions, or MEFs. Focusing first on mission essential functions, organizations can target the most critical aspects of their operations and better align their security strategies with overarching business goals. I then explore key steps in the risk assessment process, including asset identification, threat analysis, vulnerability assessment, risk prioritization, control selection, and ongoing monitoring. These steps form an iterative, end-to-end methodology that integrates people, processes, and technology to create a holistic risk management framework, one that is centered on one or more threat models. As threat landscapes, technology platforms, and organizational structures are constantly in flux, the risk analysis process must be revisited and refined regularly. Through this iterative approach, organizations can establish a robust cybersecurity posture that not only protects mission-critical functions from known threats, but also anticipates and adapts to emerging challenges in the ever-changing digital environment. The steps in cybersecurity risk analysis include the following. 1. Select a risk analysis model or a hybrid approach. Determine the organization's risk appetite. 3. Identify MEFs. 4th, inventory, classify, and categorize underlying data and technologies. Identify probable threats. 6th, identify vulnerabilities. 7. Analyze and prioritize risks. 8. Develop and recommend strategies to manage calculated risks. And 9. Document and report analysis findings and recommendations. When conducting an analysis of an MEF, we initially establish the boundaries of our assessment, which includes the underlying technology that directly supports the MEF and key personnel needed to perform the required tasks to achieve the MEF's expected outcomes. Now let's step through each of these steps. Before beginning any analysis steps, an organization should first research and select either a single risk analysis model or a hybrid, elements from 2 or more models that best fit the organization. Models fall into 7 categories based on the approach taken: attack-based, risk and issue-based, threat-based, human-centric, privacy-based, multidimensional, control-centric. Attack-based risk analysis models concentrate on understanding how an adversary might plan and execute attacks against an organization's systems, applications, or infrastructure. Risk-based risk analysis focuses on the potential business impact of adverse events, aligning security measures with the organization's strategic priorities. Threat-based approaches focus on adversaries themselves, examining their motives, capabilities, and potential objectives so that an organization can understand which threats are most likely to target it and why. Human-centric cybersecurity risk analysis models concentrate on the critical role people play in both creating and mitigating security risks. Privacy-based threat models focus on identifying, analyzing, and mitigating risks related to the privacy of individuals whose data is being processed within a system. Multidimensional models assess threats from various angles, to provide a comprehensive risk evaluation. Control-centric threat models focus on identifying security risks and mitigating them through the implementation of specific security controls. We go into much more detail on these models, with descriptions of specific threat models in each category, in Video 2. An organization determines its risk appetite by striking a balance between its strategic objectives and the level of uncertainty it is willing to accept in pursuit of those objectives. The risk appetite might be different for each MEF, so this process must be followed for each, establishing the costs management is willing to absorb if a risk manifests, based on the value of the MEF for meeting business objectives, the cost of mitigating or transferring the risk. This process generally begins with leadership defining the organization's mission, core values, and long-term ambitions, as these factors shape the boundaries of acceptable risk. Decision-makers then examine both internal and external factors that can influence the organization's tolerance for uncertainty, such as regulatory requirements, industry norms or standards, competitive pressures, the financial impact of potential losses. By reviewing past incidents, near misses, and existing risk controls, they gain insights into which threats the organization can manage effectively and which ones might exceed its capacity or resources to mitigate. The organization's financial health and market position also play a role, since a robust reserve or strong brand reputation may allow for taking on greater risk. Throughout this process, leaders consult with stakeholders across the organization to understand different perspectives, ensure alignment with operational realities, and build consensus, ensuring that the resulting risk appetite statement accurately represents the types of risks the organization is willing to pursue or avoid and forms the basis for setting policies, prioritizing initiatives, and allocating resources across various risk management activities. MEFs are the vital activities, operations, or services that an organization must execute to achieve its fundamental mission and strategic goals. MEFs frequently include essential services for stakeholders, crucial back-office functions, regulatory or compliance obligations, and other operations integral to maintaining the organization's mission. Identifying MEFs begins by defining the overarching mission and goals of the organization. At this stage, it is crucial to articulate why the organization exists, what objectives it aims to achieve, and how those objectives align with its strategic vision. This foundational understanding illuminates which operations, services, or processes are most critical to fulfilling the organization's purpose. Once these primary objectives and goals are clarified, it becomes possible to pinpoint the specific functions that uphold them. These functions could be anything from customer-facing services, for example, a website or a payment processing platform, to back-end support systems, for example, data storage, human resource management, or logistics. The organization must closely examine each function to gauge its level of importance and understand the potential impact should it fail, often involving consulting various stakeholders, such as department heads, business unit leaders, and technical experts, to ensure that all critical tasks and processes are accounted for. By involving a diverse range of perspectives, the organization reduces the risk of overlooking an essential function that may not be immediately obvious to all parties. MEFs can vary widely depending on the industry and the organization's specific objectives, but they generally represent the core activities that must remain operational for the organization to fulfill its primary mission. Examples of MEFs include the following. A hospital's ability to deliver patient care relies heavily on keeping its electronic health record system up and running, making that system an MEF. In the financial sector, a bank's capacity to process payments and maintain access to customer accounts is critical. Any disruption to these services could jeopardize regulatory compliance and customer trust. An e-commerce company would identify its online storefront, order fulfillment processes, and payment gateways as essential functions, since revenue flow and customer satisfaction hinge on their availability. A government agency charged with public safety might designate its emergency communication network as an MEF, ensuring that key personnel can coordinate and respond effectively to crises. In manufacturing, the production line, often controlled by supervisory control and data acquisition, SCADA systems, would typically be considered mission essential because prolonged downtime directly affects output and revenue. After selecting an MEF to analyze, the next step is determining all supporting dependencies required to sustain it. This involves looking beyond each function in isolation and considering the people, processes, technology, and external partners collectively enabling its operation. Functions that support or enable MEFs are those activities and services that, while not themselves mission-critical, provide the necessary foundation or resources for MEFs to operate effectively. Often referred to as supporting or enabling functions, these may include functions such as IT infrastructure maintenance, human resources management, finance and accounting, facilities management, and supply chain operations. Examples of MEF dependencies include IT support ensures that systems and networks remain functional and secure, allowing a hospital's electronic health record system, an MEF, to remain accessible around the clock. A manufacturing company relies on procurement and logistics, enabling functions to secure the raw materials and transportation needed to keep its production line, an MEF, running. While disruptions to supporting functions might not immediately halt the organization's core mission, they can significantly degrade the effectiveness or reliability of the MEFs over time, underscoring their importance in maintaining overall operational continuity. Cataloging these dependencies provides the roadmap for the subsequent asset inventory and vulnerability analysis, ensuring that the organization will examine not only the high-level functions themselves, but also the underlying technologies that make those functions possible. By proactively identifying these dependencies early in the risk assessment process, the organization establishes a comprehensive understanding of how essential operations are interwoven, ultimately guiding more targeted and effective security measures. Understanding the MEF's underlying supporting technology is the next step, identifying and cataloging all assets that support the organization's mission-essential functions, beginning by systematically listing each element that plays a role in keeping these critical functions operational, including physical hardware, such as servers, workstations, and networking equipment, software applications, data repositories, and the datasets involved, network infrastructure components, personnel, facilities, physical security. By creating this inventory, the organization gains a clear picture of the tools, systems, and resources that underpin mission-critical processes. It is equally important to assign ownership to these assets, ensuring accountability for their security and maintenance. For instance, hardware and software systems often have dedicated owners who are responsible for patching, configuration, and lifecycle management, while data sets may have designated custodians tasked with data governance and compliance duties. Once the asset inventory is established, the next step is to classify each item according to its criticality, determining how significantly the compromise or loss of an asset would affect mission-essential functions. Usually, organizations will rate the impact using categories such as high, medium, or low, although more granular systems may also be used depending on the organization's needs and regulatory environment. During classification, it is important to consider not just the direct operational impact, but also indirect implications, such as regulatory penalties or reputational damage. Assets containing sensitive data, whether intellectual property, personally identifiable information, or protected health information, may warrant a higher classification level due to legal or contractual obligations. One thing to keep in mind is that a business function might not be an MEF, but it might use highly classified data, making it a potentially high-risk if not properly protected, requiring looking beyond MEFs after data classification and categorization is complete to identify where sensitive data transits, is processed, and is stored. For a detailed look at data and asset classification and categorization, view my videos Asset Classification and Data Classification and Categorization at the links in the video description. To understand the risks associated with each MEF, we need to understand the probable threats to each, the ways in which natural and human forces, threat actors, might damage the underlying technology or compromise sensitive information. First, the organization must gather threat intelligence from multiple sources in order to build a comprehensive view of both the internal and external threat landscape, including data gathered from past incidents within the organization, as these historical events offer direct insight into weaknesses or attack methods that have already been exploited. Threat intelligence feeds provided by specialized vendors, security research groups, or industry consortiums add another layer of situational awareness by highlighting emerging tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, that attackers may use. Industry reports provide broader context, indicating which threats are particularly prevalent and how they tend to manifest in organizations of a similar size or in the same sector. By examining these sources together, the organization develops a nuanced understanding of the threat vectors most relevant to its environment, including common threat categories such as malware infections, phishing campaigns, cyber terrorists, hacktivists, social engineering, insider threats, advanced persistent threats, APTs. The TTPs associated with specific known or emerging threats include the attack vectors, the pathways threat actors use to reach or achieve their objectives by leveraging vulnerabilities, weaknesses in humans, processes, or technologies. Identifying vulnerabilities involves systematically uncovering weaknesses in both technology and organizational practices that could be exploited by the identified threats. On the technical side, the process usually begins with a comprehensive examination of systems, networks, and applications to detect common security issues, often including running vulnerability scans, which use automated tools to find known software flaws or configuration errors, as well as performing penetration tests that simulate real attacks, probing for deeper or more sophisticated vulnerabilities. Code reviews can further reveal logic errors, insecure coding practices, or other flaws that automated tools might miss. Through this effort, the organization can pinpoint missing patches, misconfigurations, or expose services. For example, a web interface that should not be publicly accessible, that create openings for attackers. However, not all vulnerabilities stem from purely technical factors. Equally important is the assessment of non-technical vulnerabilities, which can range from weak user awareness and insufficient security training to inadequate access control procedures and unclear governance models. By reviewing existing policies and procedures, the organization may discover that critical guidelines for handling sensitive data are not enforced, or that oversight for privileged user accounts is lax, creating opportunities for insider threats or accidental breaches. Physical security lapses, such as poorly controlled access to server rooms or the absence of surveillance in key locations, can also constitute non-technical vulnerabilities, since unauthorized individuals might gain access to critical infrastructure or sensitive information. Physical access by threat actors can enable bypass of most, if not all, technology controls. Once these vulnerabilities are identified and cataloged, the final step is to map them directly to the threats previously outlined, clarifying which specific weaknesses could be exploited by particular threat actors or scenarios, and enabling more precise risk determination. For example, a known external hacking threat will be especially relevant to systems that are unpatched or exposed to the internet, while an insider threat is more likely to exploit weak access controls or inadequate separation of duties. By correlating each threat to relevant vulnerabilities, the organization can more accurately gauge where its exposure is highest, which vulnerabilities need priority remediation, and how best to allocate resources to reduce the overall level of risk. Analyzing and prioritizing risks is the phase in a risk assessment during which an organization takes the threats and vulnerabilities identified in previous steps and determines the degree to which they pose a danger to the organization's MEFs. This involves two closely related tasks: estimating the likelihood of each threat exploiting a given set of vulnerabilities, and then gauging the potential impact if that exploitation occurs. By translating these likelihood and impact estimates into a risk score or rating, an organization can focus on the most urgent risks first, aligning with its overall risk appetite and tolerance. The first step is to estimate the probability or likelihood that each known threat will actually exploit a set of vulnerabilities along an attack path. For example, if a particular vulnerability is externally visible and frequently exploited in the wild, the likelihood might be high. On the other hand, if tight network segmentation or effective access controls drastically reduce exposure, the likelihood could be considered low or moderate. Simultaneously, you assess the potential impact to MEFs if that vulnerability were exploited. Impact can encompass a variety of consequences, including operational downtime, compromised data confidentiality or integrity, financial loss, regulatory penalties, and reputational damage. Because some functions are more critical than others, especially those that directly support the organization's ability to meet regulatory obligations or serve its customers, the same threat vulnerabilities pairing might carry vastly different impacts depending on which asset or function is compromised. To keep the process structured, many organizations use a risk matrix or scoring system. A simple approach is qualitative, using labels like low, medium, or high for both likelihood and impact. More sophisticated or data-rich environments may opt for quantitative scales, for example, a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 rating, to enable finer distinctions between risk levels. Whichever method is chosen, the objective is the same: to capture how probable each threat is and how much damage it could inflict. When determining and ranking risks associated with discovered vulnerabilities, it is important to remember that organizations should consider existing administrative, physical, and technical controls that increase a threat actor's level of effort and the skills needed to implement TTPs needed to achieve attack objectives, potentially lowering the probability of occurrence. We go over this in more detail in Video 3. Once likelihood and impact are established, you combine these factors to determine an overall risk rating. In a basic qualitative approach, a high likelihood paired with a high impact would receive the highest possible risk rating, whereas a low likelihood coupled with a low impact would be assigned a lower rating. Intermediate ratings, such as medium or moderate, occupy the middle ground and might still require some level of mitigation. As I demonstrate in the risk analysis walkthrough in Video 3, assignment numeric values to these ratings helps with prioritization. With these ratings in hand, you can rank the identified risks in order of severity, thus spotlighting the greatest threats to the organization. This ranking must align with the organization's risk appetite, the amount of risk it is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives, and risk tolerance, the permissible level of variation around its objectives. Some organizations place a premium on protecting sensitive data, while others prioritize uninterrupted service delivery. These considerations influence how risk is weighed and ultimately addressed. By focusing on the highest impact, most likely threats first, the organization can optimize its resource allocation. For instance, significant funds or staff time might be funneled into mitigating vulnerabilities that could trigger a breach of customer data or a lengthy production outage. Conversely, lower-ranked risks, while still important to monitor, may be addressed with less urgency or different types of mitigation, such as risk acceptance or insurance. In this way, the analysis and prioritization phase ensures that the organization's cybersecurity and business continuity efforts are both targeted and proportionate to the true level of risk. Managing the cybersecurity risks identified during a risk analysis is a multifaceted process that ensures an organization allocates resources efficiently, maintains compliance obligations, and protects critical operations against evolving threats. Once the organization completes risk ranking, it has a prioritized inventory of potential threats and vulnerabilities, each tied to specific assets, or MEFs. The next step is to interpret these findings in the context of the organization's risk appetite, regulatory environment, and strategic objectives. For example, a high likelihood, sheer high-impact vulnerability in a payment system will likely require urgent action, whereas a low likelihood risk with minimal impact might be tolerated or managed over a longer time frame. Key considerations revolve primarily around risk appetite alignment and operational context. If multiple high-rated risks surpass those thresholds, they typically warrant immediate action to mitigate or otherwise address them. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that even severe risks can present essential operational advantages under certain circumstances. For example, remote access introduces additional attack vectors, yet it is often indispensable for maintaining business continuity, especially in scenarios that require staff to work from multiple locations or under conditions that prevent on-site presence. Consequently, decisions regarding risk management must carefully balance the level of threat against the practical benefits that a given technology or process confers on the organization. The organization can use one, or a combination, of four primary strategies to handle identified risks: acceptance, transfer, mitigation, or avoidance. Each strategy should be documented to ensure transparency and accountability. Risk acceptance. The organization may accept a risk if it falls within predefined tolerance limits or if remediation costs outweigh potential benefits. For instance, a low-impact vulnerability in a legacy system might be deemed acceptable until a planned upgrade is completed. Risk transfer. This approach shifts financial losses or legal responsibility for certain risks to a third party, often through insurance policies or contractual agreements with service providers. While risk transfer helps offset potential losses, it does not eliminate the underlying vulnerability or threat. It merely reduces the financial burden if an incident occurs. It also does not remove from the organization the overall responsibility for governance, oversight for how security is applied, and risks managed to protect sensitive data and MEF-dependent infrastructure. Risk mitigation. Mitigation is typically the most common approach and involves implementing controls to reduce either the likelihood of a threat occurring or the impact if it does. Examples include patching software, hardening system configurations, training staff, or segmenting networks to contain breaches. Risk avoidance. In cases where a particular activity is deemed too risky or difficult to secure, the organization may stop performing that activity altogether. For instance, if hosting certain critical applications internally poses too great a risk, the organization may move them to a secure, compliant cloud provider or discontinue offering that service entirely. Once an organization has identified and analyzed various threats, vulnerabilities, and corresponding risks, capturing the outcomes of the assessment process in a structured, traceable manner allows for consistent referencing and decision-making over time. The first part of the documentation effort focuses on recording the results of the assessment itself. By listing each identified risk, alongside its calculated likelihood and potential impact, decision-makers have a clear snapshot of where the greatest dangers to the organization's MEFs lie. Including the rationale behind each analysis is especially valuable. Detail on how the organization arrived at a particular ranking and which data or threat intelligence influenced the evaluation demonstrates a systematic approach. Any chosen risk treatment strategies, whether involving technical controls, policy changes, or other interventions, should be noted in the documentation, creating a reference for exactly how the organization intends to address each risk. This comprehensive record-keeping, which may involve risk registers, spreadsheets, matrices, or specialized software tools, further establishes an audit trail. In the event of an incident, a regulatory inquiry, or a future assessment, stakeholders can review the decisions made, revalidate their effectiveness, and determine if new strategies are required. Equally important is the communication of these findings to all relevant stakeholders. Sharing summarized or detailed updates with leadership ensures that executives understand the organization's most pressing risks, why certain treatment measures are prioritized over others, and what residual risks remain even after controls are put in place. Technical teams require more granular information so that they can align their day-to-day tasks with the highest risk areas. Configuring network devices, applying software patches, or refining access controls is needed. Additionally, compliance officers, legal counsel, or regulators may need specific documentation to confirm adherence to relevant standards or regulations. By tailoring the depth and format of these communications to each audience's needs, the analysis team ensures that business leaders remain engaged in the decision-making process, aware of necessary investments in security, and cognizant of any accepted risks that could still materialize. Through this structured documentation and reporting cycle, the organization maintains a shared understanding of both its current risk landscape and its plan for continual improvement. Organizations can use one of three approaches to risk analysis: qualitative, quantitative, or hybrid. Qualitative and quantitative risk analyses evaluate risks using distinct methodologies, advantages, and use cases. Qualitative risk analysis is a subjective method for assessing risks based on their likelihood and impact without using numerical data. It categorizes risks into levels such as low, medium, or high based on expert judgment, experience, and predefined criteria. The process begins by identifying potential risks and assessing their likelihood, how probable they are, and impact, the consequences if they occur. Risks are typically ranked using a qualitative scale, e.g., very low to very high, and categorized into a risk matrix or risk heat map. Qualitative advantages include: easy to implement and requires fewer resources, provides a quick overview of risks, useful for organizations with limited data availability, helps in prioritizing risks before applying detailed analysis. Limitations include subjective and dependent on expert judgment, lacks numerical precision and measurable risk values, difficult to compare risks objectively across different projects. Quantitative risk analysis is a data-driven method that assigns numerical values to risks based on statistical models, historical data, and financial metrics. It provides a more objective assessment by estimating the probability of risk events occurring and their potential financial or operational impact. The process begins by collecting data on past incidents, probabilities, and financial losses associated with various risks. Probabilistic models, such as Monte Carlo simulations or decision tree analysis, are often used to calculate risk exposure. Risks are then expressed in terms of financial impact, percentages, or probability distributions. Quantitative advantages include: provides objective, data-driven insights, allows for precise financial risk estimation, helps in cost-benefit analysis for risk mitigation strategies, enables scenario analysis and predictive modeling. Limitations include: requires access to reliable data and statistical expertise, more complex and time-consuming compared to qualitative analysis, might not account for emerging risks with no historical data. Hybrid risk analysis uses some of both of the qualitative and quantitative approaches. A common approach, shown in the walkthrough in Video 3, uses the qualitative approach as a foundation, adding dollar and other numerical estimates as needed. That's it for this video. In Video 2 in this series, we look at various types of threat models, how they work, and why they are used. And until next time, be careful what you click.